Hey class, welcome back to the second video in cardiovascular system. So we're going to be talking through heart rate to begin with here. So really for resting, we've talked about this a little bit in class, but really for resting, for untrained, really it should be kind of normal, would be right around 70. I don't like the word normal, but once again, just kind of typical heart rate range we can see is really right around 70 to 80. And really a lot of organizations say kind of just average is really around 70 to 100 for resting. I know 100 seems pretty high, but really for untrained is really kind of right around that. So that 70 to 100 range. We're trained, we can see under 70 beats per minute. So typically I would say a lot of individuals that are active, we'd see right around 60 to 50 beats per minute, but really it's not unrealistic to see possibly even resting heart rates at 30 or 40 beats per minute. So some of you might have kind of resting heart rates down that low. So really aerobic training and with aerobic training, once we start the actual training itself, we can see a decrease of 1 beat per minute per week for untrained individuals. So we can see a dramatic response actually pretty quick. Really when training starts, and specifically aerobic training, really we can see that with strength training as well. We can see response definitely to resting blood pressure. We can definitely see resting heart rate as well, but really aerobic, we're going to see even more so within that. So submaximal training, really we see kind of lower heart rate at a given submaximal level for a trained individual. So following training at any given level, if we had a trained versus untrained individual, we're going to see a lower heart rate for that trained individual. Really training induced decrease in heart rate is going to be greater at higher intensities. So we're going to see more dramatic response really at that higher intensities. Really at maximal, it's kind of interesting. I would think like with training that maximal heart rates would change, but really it doesn't. So it really remains relatively unchanged during kind of those maximal efforts. So when we're talking through kind of finding a predicted heart rate max, or even when we're taking, looking at an individual with an untrained individual, we're taking to a max effort. Really, it's very similar for trained versus untrained. However, some studies show possible a decrease in trained endurance runners. So I'd like you all to kind of think through what would lead to maybe a decrease in those trained endurance runners. Really, I think the biggest thing what research is saying is really the drop, or the increase in stroke volume. The more efficient the heart is, it's pumping more blood per beat, and we actually could see at kind of that maximal level the impact on that, and actually possibly a lower heart rate due to just the efficiency of the heart. So I think that's kind of interesting. And really in recovery with heart rate, following training, heart rate's going to return to resting levels pretty quick. And this is a lot of times the possible index, and really a lot of times like Apple Watches will look at just kind of your response. I think Garmin does the same thing, kind of look at your response following exercise as soon as you stop, as kind of just a cardiorespiratory fitness, and just see how healthy that heart is and how quick it actually comes back to kind of the resting levels, or at least close to the resting levels. Really a lot of these factors really affect, it could have a huge impact definitely on just core temperature. So definitely if we're out, even just, when it's starting to get warmer now, you can see kind of not necessarily going back to the baseline levels due to what we've talked about before in thermoregulation. Stimulants as well. So if you have caffeine or some coffee, that's going to definitely be an impact in regards to kind of getting back to baseline levels and the overall recovery. And then also just the intensity and duration of the actual exercise itself is going to have an impact on just getting back to those baseline levels. So a lot of times what it looks at, especially when we're talking about possible index of cardiorespiratory fitness, it's looking at like that first maybe 10 seconds following exercise, and then it tracks that drop, and actually will stimulate, kind of can give us an idea of how quick that recovery is, but it's not necessarily going to baseline levels, but still give us an indicator of just overall fitness. So really when we're talking about kind of that heart rate interaction with stroke volume, it really the biggest thing when we're looking at cardiac output, and we haven't talked about that yet, and we'll get to that in just a sec here, but cardiac output really is dictated by heart rate and stroke volume. We've talked about this a little bit, and definitely kind of even early on in this semester, we talked about that cardiovascular drift, right? And so really, if we see a drop in stroke volume, we'd see an increase in heart rate, and that's what we talked about in regards to cardiovascular drift. And that's essentially what we're looking at, kind of that overall interaction with stroke volume and heart rate. So at max or near maximal intensity, you're going to see heart rate kind of change to really make sure that, once again, we have that combination of heart rate and stroke volume to really maximize how much blood we're pumping per minute. So if heart rate's too fast, we have that overall decrease in that diastolic filling. We're not going to actually have the heart fill up as easily as we did at kind of lower intensities. So we're going to definitely see kind of that overall less filling really within that. Also, heart rate, kind of if it's overall slow, we have a longer time for ventricles to fill. And so once again, like we talked about just on that kind of last slide, that max heart rate really decreases in elite endurance athletes just because of that increase overall in that efficiency of the heart and more filling. And then once again, more blood being pumped per beat with that stroke volume. So like we talked about in regards to cardiac output, the max amount of blood we pump per beat, actually I shouldn't say max amount, it's really the amount of blood we pump per minute, I should say, sorry. So cardiac output, the amount of blood we pump per minute, okay. Resting levels, what we could see is really 4 to 6 liters. That's all depending on the size of the heart, the size of the individual, but really around 4 to 6 liters. I would say on average for anybody, it's about 5 liters is what we kind of see in regards to cardiac output, I'd say on average. So maximal cardiac output really increases quite a bit in regards to, once again, that increase in stroke volume. How much blood we're pumping per beat is definitely going to have and dictate how much blood we pump per minute. So untrained max cardiac output, really we could see around 14 to 20 liters per minute that's actually circulating through the body, which to me sounds like a lot. If you think of those 2-liter bottles, that seems like a lot that's circulating throughout the body. But then for trained, we see that dramatically increase. So definitely you can see 25 to 35 liters per minute. And in some cases, really kind of at the elite athletes, you'll see kind of over 40 liters per minute in some cases. So that's just amazing, the amount of blood that's actually being pumped per minute. Once again, going back to just 2-liter bottles, how much 40 liters actually is per minute. That's pretty amazing. So kind of that acute response that we see to aerobic exercise, really that cardiac output, from rest to steady state aerobic exercise, cardiac output, really we're going to see that increase rapidly and then really kind of just reaches that plateau. Really what we'd see that with heart rate, see that with stroke volume, cardiac output, same thing. Maximal exercise, cardiac output, we can see that increase 4 times the resting level. Okay, the amount of blood we need to circulate per minute at maximal or really high intensity exercise is going to have to increase dramatically to be able to get that oxygen and blood supply to the working tissue. This is one that I really like here, and this is something that I would highly recommend to kind of know some of these overall numbers, and I'd say more percentages of kind of the distribution of blood to the different tissues. But really you can see at rest, it's really it's not evenly matched, but really it's distributed fairly well in regards to blood supply to kind of the vital organs, working tissues. It's really kind of in the brain. Really we see, not, it's just distributed fairly well, right? But then as soon as you start exercising, you see that dramatic increase of that blood supply to the working tissue. So you can see kind of muscles at rest really around 20%, where really you see muscles really getting 84% during exercise, right, to make sure that we get that oxygen to the working tissue. Now, one thing I will say with this is that we have more blood circulating, like we say here. You have kind of 5 liters of blood per minute at rest, where once again we have 25 liters of blood per minute that's being circulated during exercise in this. Now, one thing I would say, the percentages go down to some of these different vital organs, but the actual blood supply actually increases to some of these, so, or maybe just diminishes just a little bit. So it's the percentages are different, but the actual blood supply actually in some of these cases are getting more blood. Now, definitely during exercise, we're going to see that vasoconstriction in some of those different organs that we don't need during exercise. So we're going to see that kind of that shunting of blood to the working tissues, and we don't need as much blood to these kind of different organs. So, so this you can kind of see in this pie chart here that kind of represents that. So with the kind of acute responses, once again, to aerobic exercise, that overall control of that local circulation, kind of during the aerobic type exercise, we see that blood flow to the active muscles, like we just saw in kind of that pie chart, and really kind of that increase overall percentage to that working tissues. But that's due to that dilation in those local arteries. Definitely in the capillaries, we see more blood supply to those working tissues. But at the same time, we're going to see kind of, like I just talked about in that pie chart, kind of that vasoconstriction, or once again, kind of shunting of blood from those kind of non-vital organs or tissues going to the working tissue to really help and direct that blood to the working tissues. So, okay. So on the next video, I'm going to talk through the respiratory system. We'll talk through that next year.